Hello, everyone, and welcome to SCOTONOMIcs or episode 105. Hello, Kieran. How are you doing?
I'm good. I really like our new intro. It's very professional. Nice job. Well done.
I made sure I put Stirling Castle in the listing because that's where I've moved to. So I'm now in Dunblane,
Oh my
um,
God.
just a few miles outside Stirling. So new backdrop, new setup. We arrived on, most of our stuff isn't here yet. So we're kind of slowly just getting everything sorted. It's very different from Barcelona. Very different. I love it, but it's very different. But
Yeah,
so everyone will be seeing a lot more of me
yeah.
now that I'm here and not in Barcelona. So I hope these are all ready for that. Thanks
Please
everyone
make your
for
presence
joining.
felt in Scotland again.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Well, thanks everyone for joining us tonight. What we're going to do is we're going to cover some MMT basics, and then I'm sure we'll have time. We're going to go into a little bit of detail about that interview that Mark Blythe did for us when we invited him on to hear his opinion, not to debate or discuss, but to hear his opinion, and he was certainly gave us lots of his opinion. So I'll put a link into that interview and you can go back and watch it, and we've also got a little time section for you so you can see exactly the period when he's talking about MMT. We're not going to cover anything else that he discussed around independence and the UK and all of that stuff. We're just going to focus on his anti-MMT comments. So at any point this evening, any questions you want to put in or any comments around MMT, from the most basic, which I should be okay with, right up to the most complicated, which I'll try my best. But if not, I'll get back to you. I did speak to Dirk Entz, who's an MMT academic, and he's provided a little bit of support with some of the stuff that we're going through. So anything that's a bit too technical for me, as someone who's only been studying it for a few years, I'll pass on to Dirk. But hopefully, between Kieran and I, we'll be able to get through all the basics. So I'm ready, Kieran. Let's go. We've got some set questions, haven't we, to go through? But at any point, I'll just jump in and drop in any questions or comments from the audience.
Okay, so I have a lot of problems with my work as a counsellor with acronyms. So let's just explain the acronym. It's modern monetary theory we're talking about. So let's cover some of the basics then. What is the difference between a currency user, like a local council or the Scottish Government, and a currency issuer like the UK?
Well, I think that's probably the most important one to start with, because this is just identifying who creates money in the economy. And the Scottish Government, like Aberdeen City Council, like me and you, like a business, are users of the currency. So we have to get that currency. We have to earn it. We have to borrow it in some way. We have to find that currency. When you're the issuer of a currency, you create that currency. You effectively create that currency by typing amounts into people's bank accounts, reserve balance accounts at the central bank. That's where money comes from. So it's only the UK government or agents of the UK government that are given a license from the UK government to create money. It's only the UK government that creates public money. Scottish government doesn't have a license to do that, neither does the Welsh Assembly or anyone else. The UK government creates money when it spends. The Scottish government has to have money either through the block grant or through taxes or from the limited borrowing, and then it spends it. So all countries that you can think of, America, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, almost there's over 150 currencies in the world. All these countries are apart from the euro area, all these countries are what we call kind of monetary sovereignty, in the sense that they create their own currency, and that has a huge amount of power and influence. Now there's a commercial banks that create money as well, but it's very different from the money that's created by the UK government or any government that controls the central bank and creates.
So I'm going to interject here and just put in a couple of things here. So I really want to tell our audience and remind our audience that we're no longer in a gold standard world, because a lot of people think that we are. And the currency we're talking about is called a fiat currency. So that's quite important to know. So my next question to you is, can you cover the descriptive element of modern monetary theory and what MMT tells us about our economy?
Yeah, I think again that's another really important point, is to say to people that the core of MMT, you kind of break it down into two things, and the first thing is the descriptive element, and then there's a prescriptive element that says kind of what can you do with this understanding. But most people focus on this prescriptive element rather than descriptive element, and by descriptive I mean what's actually happening to the economy. Where does money come from? Why are taxes important? Why are bonds important? Who creates private money? What type of liquidity are we talking about? All of this descriptive stuff of the economy, focusing almost exclusively on the monetary system. That's what MMT looks at. So when we're talking about the kind of descriptive, it is saying, okay, a fiat currency, a government cannot have any, when it's got a fiat currency and it creates money, it can't have any fiscal constraint. It can't have any kind of, it can always find money to pay for stuff that's in its own currency. So there's a real kind of awareness of the limitations to a government when you take an MMT lens at it. So there's a real descriptive side that looks at the economy, looks at the financial system and says, this is how it actually works. This is what reserves are for. This is what bonds are for. This is what taxation's for. So that's the descriptive element that I said most people, certainly kind of critics of MMT, don't really think about. So when someone says to you, are you taking an MMT approach? I've kind of heard people saying it's kind of like saying, are you being aware of gravity? Are you being affected by gravity? It's an observation. There's no prescription to it unless you move to this next stage, which is the kind of prescriptive element, which is much smaller and not as kind of detailed as that descriptive part.
Yeah, and there is a policy recommended by the MMT academics. But we have to see modern monetary theory as a lens and how to look at the world and how it functions with a fiat currency. So what is that policy that they recommend?
Well, I mean, this is the element where I think I'm, when I finish my masters, I think I'm going to be talking much more about the need for MMT economists to start talking about the prescriptive element. And I think we've done the descriptive element, and I think we have to be much more like other schools of economics and say, these are our recommendations, these are the things that we can do. But right now, the core of MMT has one main policy that no one disagrees with, which is the job guarantee, which is a government ensuring that everyone who wants a job has a job. That's kind of one policy that no one will disagree with. The other kind of policy that most MMT academics will agree with, which is this idea of a zero rate on interest. So the governments pay 0% interest on any reserves, any balances that are at the central bank. So it's a zero interest rate policy. Those are the two big ones. And really, if you look at all of the academic work, it doesn't really spread much past that, but certainly over the last 5 or 6 years, there's a lot more kind of progressive ideas, I think, fitting into the prescriptive side of MMT. And when you line it to ecological economics and our ecological constraints, this is where I think MMT is really powerful. So hopefully that side's going to be much bigger than it is as we move forward. I think it's essential that MMT economists start talking about what you can do with this knowledge and how you can create an economy that's much better for everyone with this understanding.
Yeah, and of course, the job guarantee, as well as being great social policy, it's also a price stabilizer as well. So that's really important. We've got a question here. So Hashbury.
So Hashbury, is it correct to say a currency issuing government cannot go bankrupt? Yes and no. I'll just confirm that. It can't go bankrupt in its own currency, but if it has a substantial foreign debt, then it can go bankrupt. And that's basically where all of the problems. So when people talk about countries like Argentina or some African countries, it's always borrowing in another currency that causes the huge issues. When you've got a fiat currency and you're a currency issuer, you're always able to pay the debt or pay the interest on your currency. So it is true to say that a currency issuing government like the UK governments can never go bankrupt. So some of these analogies like households and all of that thing, when you understand that the government can always create money to pay for its debts, theoretically, it can never go bankrupt.
So why do governments choose to account for spending with taxation and borrowing / bonds?
Yes. This is a choice. This is a policy choice. And if anyone has watched it, well, as I'm sure most of the audience have, the general election, there's no discussion around certain elements of the economy. And the biggest one, the most important one at the moment, is this idea that there's no money to spend on National Health Service or Scottish Health Service or wherever you are, unless you tax people. And this is clearly the kind of economic paradigm and the narrative that we've got at the moment. Well, as an MMT economist, we would say, you choose to tax for reasons and you choose to sell bonds for reasons, but neither of them are about earning revenue to pay for stuff. They're completely, that's not what these are for. And if we've got time, we'll go into that. But it's really important that the framework that we have at the moment forces governments to say that they're taxing and borrowing to equal expenditure. Now, my very personal view on this is that this is the way that we limit public money and increase private money. And if you're already wealthy, you don't make any money from the government spending money into the economy. Whereas if you're wealthy and you have some money and you paid interest on that money, then you earn from that. So I think this whole narrative that's been, around since, at least a couple of 100 years, this idea of the Treasury view, is very much to ensure that the money that's in the system, someone pays interest on that, and it keeps the wealthy wealthy and it keeps the poor poor. So I think that's the fundamental reason why this happens. I think it's a structural and a constructed way to make sure that the establishment stays in power and stays wealthy. And the government choose to do this. They could absolutely move to another paradigm, an MMT paradigm, and say that we will pay for stuff because we have the resources. We don't need to tax. We don't need to sell bonds. This is a huge shift from where we are. But that main point, Karen, is it's a choice. It's a political choice. You've not got that much space when you're talking about the influence of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and how everything else is kind of structured. But it is a policy choice to link taxation and borrowing to spending.
Yeah, I mean, when I first discovered this and listened to Bill Mitchell, it was very clear to me, perhaps more sensitive to me as a person who's not ever had much money, that that's what was going on. It seemed very obvious to me. But so taxation, why is taxation so important? What's important with taxation?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll just put this up, Charles, because I'm going to ask you just to clarify that. So does the fiat description hold if a currency is backed by planetary resources rather than, say, gold reserves? So I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. If you want to help me out with just another kind of clarifier, we'll come back and do that.
I guess one of the things that does definitely back a currency is the rule of law. So the rule of law is really important for the validity of a currency. You know, your currency is not going to be popular if you have a load of bandits running about killing people in your country. It's not, people aren't going to want your currency.
Yeah. I think that's certainly, we'll see if we get other questions on that. But the role of the currency and the importance, I think, is really good. Okay, tax. So tax is really important, but tax is the thing that makes, and this might strike people as being a little bit weird, but tax, this horrible thing, tax, is the thing that makes our society work. And when you're taxed in a currency, it means you have to accept that currency because you need to pay your tax. You need to pay your tax in that currency. So this thing that is of no intrinsic value, this little bit of paper, is valuable to you because if you don't pay your tax with it at the end of the year, you'll probably go to jail. So this creates an incentive to capture this currency, to use this currency, to exchange it. So the role of taxation is the thing that fundamentally underpins all of the currency that we use. And this is a very different approach from you would have from from orthodox economists who would be looking at money in a very different form. So taxes they're like the glue or kind of like the concrete that makes the whole society work, because this one form of currency is accepted because you have to pay the tax in it. And because it's so valuable in that sense, it gives it worth and it can be exchanged, and everyone knows that everyone else needs it because they've got to pay tax for it. So this link between the need to pay part of this currency to the government in tax is what kind of holds everything together. But taxes don't fund the spending. So that's the kind of core bit of tax. But it's really important that when you're spending, you use tax to reduce the amount of kind of stress on the economy in terms of price rises. So you use tax to reduce the overall demand in an economy to make sure there's not runaway prices. So tax is really good for that. It's really good for incentivizing something. You know, you put 100% tax on a beef burger so that people eat more fake meat. No, there's taxation is really, really good for that. And fundamentally, it's essential for trying to make sure that your economy is as equal as possible. So this idea that the wealthier you are, the higher percentage of tax that you pay, which used to be something that no government in the West would ever go against, but it's certainly something that we're slowly drifting away from, this idea of progressive taxation. So taxation, really, really important, but it doesn't pay for the services when you're a currency issuer. When you're in the Scottish Government's position or the local authority, you know, where you are, Kieran, it's very different. Tax is how you bring in money to spend. So it's really important that people realise that when we're talking about the money that the Scottish Government has, it is fixed in the sense that they have to get that from somewhere. Whereas the UK government, it's not fixed. It's a policy choice not to spend that extra money on the things that we think our government should be spending. So a really, really clear difference. And it's probably worth me just saying, Kieran, that the current plan by the Scottish government is that when we're independent for maybe a decade, we will still operate as a currency user and not an issuer. And hopefully people can start to see the huge differences in terms of power and ability when you issue a currency compared to when you use a currency.
Yeah, I guess the other way of maybe rounding it up is that it's really important for social engineering. And, you know, the social engineering that we've seen after the past 14 years of a Conservative government is to socially engineer lots of inequality, which will probably see them out of office tomorrow. So why do governments sell bonds? That is exchanging one form of risk-bearing money, cash, for another, which are bonds.
Yeah. Well, we'll do bonds and then we'll come back to Charles because he's given us a lot more information. Bonds are similar to taxation. There's an understanding that you have to borrow money for the government to be able to pay. And, you know, again, this is a very natural, easy metaphor to think of when it's me and you're talking about, or the Scottish government. So basically, the idea is you get a little bit of paper that says, here's, you know, we will pay you £10,000 in a year's time. Can you give us that £10,000 now? And then you give them back the £10,000 plus a little bit of interest, like we would do at the bank. That's what happens when you're borrowing. Now, what actually happens when the UK government borrow is they go to the auction these bonds or gilts in the commercial market, and they say, we've got these gilts and we're going to pay 5%, and the commercial banks have got all of this money in the reserve balance accounts earning 4%. Okay, so they say, I tell you what, I'll buy that 100 million worth of government bonds because I'm getting 5% on it rather than 4%. So government gilts always sell as long as you offer a higher payment for that form of savings than you do government debt, for reserve balance accounts. So just to kind of pick that can be a little bit complicated. All the commercial banks have got billions of pounds in their reserves and they earn interest on that. And that's why they're doing so incredibly well at the moment, because they've got to earn, you know, they're earning 5% interest on that. So loads. But if the government want to borrow money, they just offer a bond or a gilt for paying more than 5% and it's bought. Now, when you explain it like that, it's really difficult to see how that could be classed as borrowing in any way. So basically, you're giving the government, you're taking out 100 billion out of your reserve balance account, and you're effectively giving that to the government in exchange for 100 billion plus interest. So it's a transaction, it's an exchange of currency. So when the government borrow, what they're doing is exchanging a promise to pay some more money in the future for the money to be taken out of their account that they're being paid for already. Borrowing is just completely completely the wrong word for us to use. And I think if people understood that, it would be much clearer. But bonds are really important, because if you want to keep an interest rate at a certain level, you need a certain amount of reserves. So you sell bonds to drain reserves. You'll buy back bonds if you want to put more money into the reserves. And this happens every day. I mean, there's billions of pounds worth of transactions go on between the government and commercial banks every day to try and manage this interest rate at the policy rate, which I think is around about 5% at the moment. So bonds are crucial for that. They're also a great way to say to the private sector, hey, if you want to save, if you want a save that you know you're guaranteed going to get a return for all the reasons we said earlier, the government can't run out of money. It's a brilliant way to save. So if you've got extra cash, you know, if you're sitting with thousands or hundreds of thousands of pounds, bonds are absolutely amazing because you're guaranteed a return. So they play a crucial role. You know, Norway sells bonds every year, billions of krona worth of bonds every year, despite having this massive government surplus, because bonds play an essential role in the economy. A government, when it sells the bond, also sets the rate for other types of borrowing. So it has a hugely important role, like taxes. But for some reason, we miss all that. No one discusses all of that. And they concentrate on something that's not true, which is that we need to borrow. And I really like that idea. It's kind of like, if you create something, you know, if you've got an orchard, right, and you've got an infinite amount of orchards, why would you possibly go to someone and borrow apples? And this is what's happening with the government. The UK government has an infinite amount of money. The idea that it needs to go and borrow it is just a position that we've driven ourselves down that makes no sense unless you look at it from the lens of this idea of the establishment wanting to make as much money as possible. So bonds, important, but not for funding, similar to taxes.
Yeah, I mean, you could describe it as gaslighting, because in reality, the national debt could also be called the national savings.
Yes, absolutely, and so that's perfectly explained, that one. So Charles, again, sorry, it's I think other people in the stream are getting it, but yeah, similar to what you said, Kieran. It's like, you know, it's how well structured is your society? How important is money in that society? Is it accepted? Do you have a rule of law? What happens if you don't pay your taxes? All of these things are really important. This idea that kind of like something's worth money because you've got 100 million people, that you know, if you're kind of touching on that, Charles, that doesn't quite work. You know, America's money's not 1,000 times more than the Faroe Islands because they've got more people and more natural resources. It's separate from that, but the institutions of government and the role of money in society is really important to give it value.
Yeah, I think Charles makes a really good point there about resources.
Yeah, he said it could be. I could be confusing currency confidence and currency value here. I think that's what you're doing, Charles. But both of those things make complete sense.
Okay, so tell us about the damage of the shared belief in the need for a fiscal framework for the UK, aka learned helplessness.
Yeah, so learned helplessness is how Stephanie Kelton describes this idea that we have to keep government debt to a particular level of GDP, and the government deficit to a particular level of GDP. And the kind of standard is that anything over 60% of your government debt to GDP is too high. And a deficit of more than 3% a year of deficit to GDP is too high. So you've got to structure all of your government spending to get to these limits. So we're in a position where we're seeing through this general election campaign of someone saying, look, I know that our hospitals are overcrowded. I know that our, you know, all of these issues, I know that our buildings are falling down. I know that we need an energy company, right? But we haven't got the money for it because we've set, and that's true, you know, and that's in a sense, that is true. If you've given yourself a straitjacket of these rules, then you don't have the money for it. It's kind of irrelevant if someone says, well, you do. That argument doesn't really make sense if you've said, I can only spend this amount. And that's what successive governments have done in the UK. And that's what happens in Europe. And that's what happens in most countries because of this kind of nefarious approach to our economy that wants as little public money as possible and as much private money as possible. But that's that learned helplessness, that you're setting yourself a level where you can't do the things that you want because you don't want to go over this fiscal framework. And it's important to say that these figures are completely made up. There is absolutely no, you will not find even a neoclassical economist who will say that 110% is too high. If the economy is growing, then it doesn't matter if it's 200% and this is from a neoclassical perspective. So this 60% is completely made up, and it's the same with this 3% made up. And we've had Dirk Entz on the show before and at SCOTONOMICS talking about where this 3% came from, and it was literally, well, what's the deficit in France right now? Oh, well, it's 3%, right? Let's say that. 1 sounds a bit low, 5 sounds a bit high. So these figures are so important. Absolutely. They're so important to the way that our government are running our economy, and they are arbitrary, and they are impacting every single decision that our government makes.
Yeah, and that arbitrary straitjacket is having very serious political consequences in the EU right now. So what are the constraints for government and all private spending? Because when we talk about modern monetary theory, initially, the first thing is that people will say, oh, you can't just spend money. Yeah, that's right. We can't. So what are the constraints?
Yeah. The constraints are not financial ones, in that the government can spend as much money as it wants, and it can create that money, and it can buy things with that. But at some point, there's going to be too much government money in the system that starts driving prices up really quickly, and we have inflation. But the important point is the government spending is only part of the overall spending. And again, we never hear, when's the last time you heard a commentator an economic commentator or a politician saying there's too much private money being created at the moment and it's leading to inflation? You never hear that. You only hear that it's public money that creates inflation. And if you look at this as like a bathtub and you've got 2 taps, a hot water tap, which is public, and a cold water tap, which is private, the bath flows over. It doesn't matter. It doesn't not flow over when it's hot. Yeah, exactly. And this is again to underline this kind of perspective that public money is seen as bad and private money is seen as good. There's a spending constraint in the economy. If there's too much money and it creates runaway prices, then there's been too much money created. So you've got to match it to resources. And we look out of our windows now and we know that there's hundreds of thousands of Scottish people unemployed. We see empty buildings. We see all these empty resources. We know that we could be spending so much more money in our economy to make all these things work again. And if we were independent and had our own currency, and we were ignoring these ridiculous things like fiscal rules, we'd be able to spend, and we'd be able to create the type of economy that we want, because there's no hard constraint on the amount of money that a government spends until it gets to a point where it's driving inflation. And that's it. And people talk about, MMT, well, you get loads of inflation. MMT economists spend so much more time on constraints than any other type of economist. We are so aware of the impact of spending on inflation. But of course, inflation comes from other places. And I think it's really important that as we move into a world where we've got to deal with this climate crisis, that we will be in a position where the government has got to say, hey, we have got to spend 100 billion on water defences, right? Flood defences. So that means that the private sector, you've got to spend 100 billion less on coffee machines and fancy designer clothes and all of these other private consumption, because at some point we realize that there's too much spending causes inflation, and we have to decide, do we want these things that save us, our lives, our planet, or do we want these things that just kind of make us happy for a few minutes and, are useful and then never used again? So these constraints are really important. I think it's MMT economists who've completely got a handle on that.
Yeah, I think there is a class of person, and that's some people in the investor class who see public money as competing with their investments. But of course, we're talking about investing in things that are not really designed to create profits. So why has no political party in the UK yet adopted an MMT lens? Why do you think?
What do you think, Karen? Why do you think no one's in? Why do you think no one's
Well, I
interested
think
in
it's
it?
partly to do with the reason I've just given, which is the investor class are hugely powerful and have influenced our politicians to such a great extent, perhaps even threatened them. I don't know. I'm guessing now. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we are looking at parties of the left, and the closest you'll get to anyone who's kind of saying these types of things is the Green Party, but they're still not anywhere near this clear idea of what taxation, and it's all about we need to tax the wealthy, and this is just learned helplessness again. If you're the wealthiest in society, you want to create this kind of narrative that society doesn't work without you. And that's what's happened, and that's what working class and middle class people have followed and been allowed. They're just being, as you said, they're being gaslit. We do not need the wealthiest in society to pay for anything. We do not need their taxes. We need to tax them because they've got too much money, which leads to too much power. That's what we need to do. That's what we need to use taxes for. So these policies can only be adopted by a left-wing political party. And unfortunately, in the UK, we don't have a left-wing political party. And I think the Greens are kind of the closest, but there's still a lack of understanding. Now, I think there is a huge potential, and we've got so much support from international MMT economists and academics about what could happen in Scotland. And Scotland is the country that could start looking at MMT lens and also the prescriptive side of it. And it would be absolutely transformational if we were able to do that. Political parties do not adopt MMT because they are scared of the establishment, but there's also a huge lack of awareness about the current economic framework, who benefits from it, and what it says compared to a true and a real world understanding of the economy. So it's not yet, Kieran, not yet we could put in that in.
So William, how do you think that modern monetary theory has been identified as the magic money tree? How do you think that came about?
Yeah, well, I think I think it's a real coincidence that MMT stands for magic money tree, because we've identified the magic money tree. And I'm quite comfortable with people saying to me now, and I think it's quite a good way. And I would encourage other people who are supportive of MMT to say to people, that's exactly what it is. Because it's a really good way to kind of turn that round to someone and say, MMT can stand for magic money tree if you like, because we've identified where money comes from and there's not a constraint, and the government creates it. And, you can kind of really get into that. But effectively, there is a magic money tree, and that's the central bank of a currency issuing government, because it can recreate as much currency as it wants. So I think we should take that MMT, and I think we should turn that magic money tree and turn it back onto people, because people will listen, because they've been told so much that there's no such thing as a magic money tree. But when you explain to them what money is, how it's created, where it comes from, and I've done this loads of times with people in the pub, they get it. And that is the most frustrating thing, Karen, is that, going back to your earlier question, if a political party was bold enough to have these conversations with people, the electorate is intelligent enough to understand it, because they know that something reeks. They know that there's something wrong. And when you explain to them what it is, where money comes from, you demonstrate it. Maybe they don't get it instantly, but it's not difficult for people to realize that the system is currently biased towards the wealthy or the already wealthy, and away from the people who are the normal, the kind of, the many, or the 90%. But that MMT magic money tree thing, I think, is really, really important.
Okay, so now
Can we go? Can we get a couple? Can we do a couple of questions from?
Yeah, do a couple of questions before I get to the next one.
Jim, again, drop me a note on what you mean, because I don't think we are talking about the Bradbury pound. It was a while ago, that question, so drop us a note. I think we're definitely talking about the difference between a currency issuer and a currency user there. Can currency issued spending overseas, PPP, vaccines, be written off, or is it only safe to write off domestically issued currency? If you've bought PPP, then you will exchange your pound for whatever currency you bought that PPE in. So you've spent that currency. So writing it off or anything doesn't kind of makes sense because you've bought it. But if you're writing off a debt that someone owes you, then absolutely you can write that off, and there's no consideration or issues around that at all. Here's one here. You just reminded me when I asked an old Tory and Cathcart question. He turned it back by saying, what do you think? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I'm not sure. I'm not sure, Asbury. Okay. Charles said I was talking about the Bradbury. Okay. All right. I think we've covered those. Ones.
Okay. So during our interview with Mark Blythe, he very handily summarised his argument against modern monetary theory by stating that if someone can explain to me why the current account is not an external constraint, I would be willing to listen. So, William, do you want to have a go at explaining why the current account is not an external restraint, but first explain what the current account of a monetary sovereign government actually is?
Okay. So this is going back, for those who don't know, we interviewed Mark Blythe, and he was, as I said at the top of the show there, he was very disparaging about MMT. And I went back and I looked at his argument. At the time, Karen and I are on the screen saying, well, we don't really agree with that. But I went back and I looked at his argument, and he did kind of sum it up, and he said, if someone can explain why the current account's not an external constraint. And he was talking about the current account in the same way that people talk about printing money and inflation. And he was just saying you can't spend loads of money because there's inflation. And we would say, well, MMT economists have dealt with that. We're more aware of that than anything. But Mark's suggestion was that the current account was an external barrier, that the Scottish government, let's use Scotland as the example, the Scottish government couldn't spend loads of money into the economy when it has a trade. The current account is better known as like a trade deficit. So he was just saying, if Scotland has a trade deficit, which it will have, by all, as best that we can do, look at the data at the moment, it will have a trade deficit. That becomes a constraint on how much government money can be printed. So he was saying there's a constraint on the spending of the government because it's running a trade deficit. And that was his point, that MMT can't work because Scotland will have a deficit. So the current account is just the amount of goods and services that are traded, your country with the rest of the world. And if you've got a deficit, then you can't spend as much money as you want. That's the core bit of his argument. And as you said, he summed it all up for us. He said, if someone can give me an answer to that, then he'd listen. And I've done that. So,
okay. So when the people of Scotland decide they want independence and we set up our own central bank and currency, what will the constraints be if we import more than we export?
So an MMT economist would say that there's no constraints if you have a trade deficit. And that's really important because that's going against the absolute opposite of what Marx said. So what I kind of wanted to do was look at Marx's perspective. Why is he saying this? So he would say an independent Scotland government fiscal space, or how much money it can spend, is limited because it runs a trade deficit. So that's his really clear kind of point. Where if it creates currency without matching it with bond or taxation, it prints money, as he calls it, the currency will be devalued because there's no external demand. So you're creating that money. There's no external demand for the things that money's creating. It leads to inflation. So that's why it's a constraint. Now, he's saying on the flip side, of course, if Scotland is selling loads of exports, if it's selling loads of exports, then it won't have a constraint. So he's really clear that if we import loads, we'll just get the terminology correct here. If we import loads, then there's a constraint. If we export loads, there's no constraint, because that'll lead to a devaluation of the currency. So that's kind of his core argument. And I said, it's just talking about this kind of printing money in this fiscal space.
Yeah. So I guess the thing is, if you are, but then if you're exporting more and if you're exporting more than you're importing, you're also pushing out your natural resources and more natural resources than you're pulling in. Is that the problem?
No, so what I wanted to, I didn't want to cover this idea that MMT think imports are good and exports are bad, because I think this just takes us onto a completely different thing. That's not Marx's argument, and I think you can argue against that without, really doing something that completely flips people round. So no, it's simply Marx's argument is that there's too much spending in the economy. People won't want your currency because you're not exporting, and you'll get you'll get loads of inflation, and you'll get a devalued currency. So that's kind of core of his argument.
So there was an implication that somehow Scotland is an outlier, but we are surrounded by medium-sized countries, and I just want to interject that we are a medium-sized country on the world scale, and they are monetarily sovereign, like Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. So how do they function?
Yes, and this is where we get into the kind of real world, and this is where I think our argument's really strong against what Marx said. So he was basically saying that unless you're the USA, you cannot do MMT. This kind of, again, honing in on just this one policy, you cannot do MMT. And if you don't do that, if you do MMT, his phrase was, it makes you poor as shit, right? And that's what he said. He says, because you just end up as poor as shit. Right, so that's Marx's argument, and I've got the time here, 31:23 to 33:40. Look at the argument, and that's what he said. So this drop in currency is bad. You can't afford imports. It makes you poor as shit. The only country who can run big government deficits because they have the global financial reserve is the United States. And he thinks that MMT does not apply to any other country because it doesn't hold the global reserve currency, which is the dollar.
Yeah, but of course, these countries are they're running fiat currencies, and they're operating the same way in a sense. So what about the UK? How is it performing regarding its balance of trade?
Yeah, so the UK hasn't had a trade surplus since 1997. Okay, so Mark's looking at this situation and he's saying, if you have a trade deficit, it's really bad and you're going to be poor as shit, right? And the UK's not had a trade surplus since 1997, right? So that's more than a quarter of a century. So I was just thinking, even if you give all the kind of, the argument over to Mark and you're like, you're right, we've got 25 years, right? Where we are now within the UK, we've got 25 years before you could argue that there's a problem, because we're in a situation right now where we're running a big trade deficit. Now, maybe Scotland's deficit will be larger, and we would argue that's not a problem. Maybe it would be a bit smaller, but even if that's the case, we've got at least, using Mark's argument, quarter of a century to kind of sort out all this stuff. So it's a really difficult argument, I think, when you're looking at Scotland as part of the UK. But some of the other countries really blow this idea out of the water.
Yeah, so can we look at can we take a wee look deeper into the arguments of current account deficits and surpluses?
Yeah, okay. So again, I've tried my very best to give Mark's argument, which is difficult for me because I don't believe it at all. But I've done some reading, I've read it a few times. This is what he would say. So if you export less, then there's a lower demand for your currency. And that kind of makes logical sense, right? So at some point, you're a country, if you've imported loads and you've not exported much, then at some point you're going to have to kind of rein it in, right? And you have to start bringing in less imports because you've got this big deficit. And because no one wants your currency, because of nothing to buy with it, because your exports are going down or relative to your imports, then you become poor. That's the kind of core argument, I think. And for me, there's a logical part of that, right? That, if no one wants your money to buy something, then it has less value. Would you agree? That's logical, and it kind of makes sense. But so that's where he is. However, and there's a really big however here, that's not backed up for a couple of reasons that I'll cover in the real world, right? So there's lots of countries who have more imports than exports. I think 2/3 of the world's countries have more imports than exports, right? And they're not all poor as shit. So where is the evidence that this argument, if you run a trade deficit for a period of time, you turn poor as shit? Because that is his argument, but I can't find any evidence. So, when I was doing a little bit of research here, so countries with a persistent deficit, Australia, New Zealand, Finland, Belgium, Switzerland, Estonia, Iceland, all of these countries which are really similar to us are not poor as shit. And Australia since 1960, right, has had 3 years where it had a surplus. 3 years since 1960. New Zealand, I think, has had 5 or 6 since 1998. Persistent big deficits for small and medium-sized countries are the norm, and these countries are not poor as shit, right?
So why are these countries not poor as shit?
Well, because I think I want to make one point. What I think a really important point, a really general point is that someone like Mark, an economist like Mark, an orthodox-ish economist, really likes this kind of simple mechanics, right? And he's saying big trade deficit equals low demand for currency, right? But the economy is so, and as a heterodox economist, we realize the economy is so complicated that it's really unlikely that one macroeconomic indicator like trade deficit would devalue the currency. It's unlikely that if you've got high unemployment rate, it would devalue the currency. It's unlikely if you're running a slightly higher inflation, it would devalue the currency. It might do the exact opposite. If you've got high interest rate, it might devalue the currency. It might not. But these things are so complicated. So just to look at something and say, have a deficit, poor as shit, that's just not how the economy works. And it does in the models. If you've got really simple mathematical models that have to come up with these conclusions, like orthodox economists have, then you can find that. But in the real world, it doesn't work like that. And we can find, as a heterodox economist, we can find the evidence that says, well, why is Switzerland not poor as shit? Why is Finland, Estonia? And the models don't kind of explain that. They have loads of externalities or just wait, but in the long term, it'll have to balance and all these things. So that's why they're not poor as shit, because there's no direct relationship between a trade deficit and a low currency. No one can find it. I think it was Ben Bernanke, the former Fed chairman, who said these models, and I'll find the direct quote, I know I've got it in some of our articles, but these models are as you're as likely to know the direction of a currency using these models as you are by tossing a coin. So he was just saying it's complete chance. So the type of thing that Mark is saying, that this happens, it goes down. Even the Federal Reserve chairman, you can find a more orthodox economist, said the relationship is not as clear as this. So for Mark to have this kind of confidence to say this will happen and that'll happen, he's got to be challenged. Absolutely. Now, he might be right, Kieran. He might be completely wrong, but he's got to be challenged that his view, that he can say that with such confidence, because there is no evidence, or very, very, very little evidence, that there is that relationship. And these are the things that we would have said to him had that interview been about challenging him and not listened to his point of view. Now, there's a more technical point to that question, why are they not poor as shit? And I'll try and cover this as easily as I can. Now, again, the models that Mark uses, they consider that every single pound that's exchanged with a dollar is for trade, right?
Yes.
And this is where the logic comes in. If you're just using money to buy things and there's less things to buy and there's a lower demand, the price will drop. That's the logical part, right? But if you look at the Bank of International Settlements or any other data, they'll say that over 90% of transactions for currency have nothing to do with trade, right? So 90% of people are looking at a currency and they're buying it thinking it's going to go up or down, right? And the currency market is by far the biggest market. It's 100 times bigger than trade. I think it is more than 100 times bigger than global trade. And I won't tell you the stats because I can't remember exactly, but it's huge. People trade currencies, never buying anything. Yes. So if Mark's argument's right, it's only 10% of all of these transactions. So again, he's talking about this massive kind of tipping point. At best, talking about a relationship that I would question on 10%. So let's say there's a 1 to 2% increase in your imports when Scotland becomes independent. We start importing a little bit more. That's a tiny percentage. And when it's only 10% of this overall amount of money that's being changed in your currency, that's why it doesn't have any impact, because it doesn't have any impact. And finally, if you speak to currency traders and you say to them, oh, the UK's deficit went up, they go, I don't care. It's irrelevant to me. I'm looking at all these other factors and where my positions are. It's just not the real world. And again, to re-emphasize that, for Mark to say something so categorical, I think is really, it's just something I completely disagree with. And everything that I say, I would always say, this is my opinion, here's what the evidence is. So that's why that poor as shit thing does not hold any water for me.
Yeah, so fundamentally, the belief that a current account deficit makes you poor as shit is really on shaky empirical ground.
Absolutely. And if you look for the evidence, and if you really want to look into the kind of models that suggest this stuff, there's no basis there, and there's certainly no real world evidence that this type of thing happens. And if a currency devalues, normally, you know, and this happened in Iceland after the financial crisis, normally if it devalues, after about 3 years, it's just back at where it was. You know, because currency traders look at these things and they look at, you know, they might see, oh, the deficit's gone up, right? And they might think, oh, that's really bad, I'm going to sell. But 3 months later, they've forgotten about it and they just buy it again. So again, these things, so again, using Mark's kind of terminology, maybe we'll be poor as shit, right, for 3 years, and then we'll be back to exactly where we are 3 years later. I completely disagree with it. But these are kind of the extremes of where you can go using the logic that's in Mark's argument.
So how can the spending of a monetary sovereign government impact positively on their economy?
Yeah, and Mark never mentioned that. And MMT detractors don't. They say you're going to run up this massive fiscal deficit, right? You're going to print all this money, and that's going to cause inflation, and people are going to, it's going to increase your amount of imports. But you're like, well, hold on a minute. If you're going to criticize MMT, you need to talk about some of the MMT policies beside running up a larger fiscal deficit. So this money that we're going to be spending, the money that we're going to be printing, is going to give everyone in the economy a job, right? It's going to guarantee everyone an economy. It's going to bring on the most important resource that we have as a nation online, and it's going to make these people do meaningful stuff. And it's going to start to create the type of economy that we want. Hey, that's a pretty good way to spend your money. And again, looking at it from Mark's perspective, if you're an investor and you're thinking, well, do you know what? The government's spending loads of money and all these people have now got money and they've got jobs. The aggregate demand in this country, so everything that people are spending and making starts to go up. And investors are going to go, I'm going to invest in this country here. Right. I'm not going to invest in this country that's spending no money, has loads of people who are unemployed, who are doing nothing progressive, who are not building railways, who are not building infrastructure. I'm going to invest in this country, and that country can be Scotland. If we put our resources, we bring our resources back into our economy, and we give people good, meaningful jobs. So MMT detractors, even Fox Mulders of MMT, don't look at the whole policy. Now, Mark might be able to say the job guarantee is a terrible idea, but he never discussed that, and he summarised that talking about this current account deficit. So people never look at what that spending goes on, and I think that if you do this in a structured way, then MMT policies, which would be the job guarantee scheme, maybe higher government deficits over a short period of time to create the type of economy we would want, become really, really beneficial. And that's not looked at. It's just this kind of concentration on this idea that you're printing money. Yeah, but what are you doing with it? There's no way you can have this conversation where you don't say, yeah, but what are we doing with it? And this is what Fidel Kabud would talk about as well. And he would say, well, actually, if you've got all that money and you're securing your food security, which Scotland needs to do, and you're enhancing your energy security, which Scotland's got to do, and you're enhancing your technological security, which Scotland needs to do, then you're spending it. But also, what are you doing with these three things? You're reducing your imports of food, you're reducing your imports of energy, you're reducing your technological import. So all your so you're importing a lot less with all of these policies. So again, you can't just look at this devaluation pure as shit when the money's been really well spent and it's reducing the type of deficit that Mark seems really concerned about.
I think it'd be a good idea for you to explain what you mean by aggregate demand.
Yeah, sure. So if you're an investor, you look at an economy and you're thinking, where's the economy that's kind of bubbling? Where are things happening? You know, where's there good returns? And this tends to be in countries where there's growth and there's expenditure. And aggregate demand is just the amount of demand in the economy the amount of aggregate demand in the economy. So how much money is everyone spending, the government and the private sector, and what types of things are being created. So aggregate demand is really important if you're an investor. You wouldn't want to invest in a country if you're looking to, and again, this is all Mark's terminology, capital, you know, we need the capital and we need investors and all this. Again, we'll disagree with that on another podcast. But if that's what you're saying, a country with high aggregate demand, with high government spending and the right things, is really attractive to investors. So that's why I think it's really important to kind of consider that spending.
So do you think there's some other hyperbole that we could use in this instance that wouldn't be the same as Mark's?
Yeah. I think it would be very easy to argue that if Scotland did introduce the types of policies that I would be recommending, and most MMT economists would support, we might be rich as fuck, Karen, and not put as shit. Right, but again, that's it. It's just there's no way that I would say do this and Scotland will be rich as fuck, right? Because it's not like that. The world's not like that. The economy's too complicated. There's loads of it depends, and these things, there's a hyperbole and soundbite about it, but that's why I've got issues with this. But I think you need to put the argument forward that we would be in a very strong position if all of these things took place, and my argument wouldn't be us about being rich as fuck. My argument would be very much about us living within our planetary boundaries and everyone having wonderful public services and a society and a community that we want to spend time with, and knowing that your mum's looked after and that you're safe at night and there's low prison numbers and mental health is not as much of a concern. Now, these are all the things that I would talk about rather than being this kind of financially well off.
Yeah, so to round up, a negative balance of trade is not quite the disaster it's often painted as.
No, it's not. And again, we kind of covered this earlier, and maybe we'll do an episode on this idea that imports are good and exports are bad. Maybe we'll do that in another one. But there's very little evidence that this is any kind of constraint for a government. You can make the argument, again, I don't personally agree with it, you can make the argument that it's more of a constraint for countries in the global south, but it's really difficult to make this argument for a small, medium-sized global north country, which is relatively wealthy, because you look at all of the similar states, as we did at the start, Finland, Estonia, Iceland, Belgium, Switzerland, who all have the UK, who all have consistent trade deficits.
But we know of another economics professor who has a different view, doesn't he?
Yeah, when I've been looking into this, I'm reading a lot from Bill Mitchell, who we've never had on the show, and he's one of the kind of founding fathers of MMT, and this is, I was thinking about how to kind of end this, but these are not my words, right? This is what Bill Mitchell said. So, looking at what Mark said, Mark has put forward the views that, and this is Bill's quote, trades on an incomplete understanding of macroeconomic realities and exploits powerful metaphors to ensure that these realities and policy opportunities are obscured from vision. So he's talking about Mark opening up this world of learned helplessness. And this was the big point that came across from it. It's kind of like Mark just said, there's nothing you can do. You can't do these things that Scotland wants to do because you'll be poor as shit. And I just kind of want to say to him, and anyone who has this view, do you know what? You might be right, but I tell you what, I want to try. And I want to make sure that we try and make these things happen. And they might not work, but right now, the state of our economy right now and the state of our communities and the state of our society is absolutely shambolic, and we've got to do something. And there's a huge body of evidence that suggests that the MMT policies, the lens is exceptionally useful, but the policies that we've been talking about will make a significant difference. And as I said, I'll die trying, because I'm not willing to sit by and see what the orthodoxy, this learned helplessness, which Mark in his way, as Bill said, is supportive. The only people who understand the opportunity that we've got are heterodox economists, and this understanding of MMT really helps us look at what the options are.
So what could all of this mean for an independent Scotland?
Well, it could be amazing, but it could also not work, right? And this is where it's such a good question, Ken, but you know the issue that when you're talking about an independent Scotland, well, if you've got an independent Scotland that follows the fiscal framework that the UK has, right, then these things can't happen, right? If you've got an independent Scotland that focuses all of its resources on exports, then the wealthiest in society just get wealthier, because that's what happens when exports. And then our companies get to a size where they start making loads of money that a foreign investor, a foreign company just comes in and buys them. You know, so there's so many things that we've got to do to make Scotland successful. So it's kind of like, a better question is, what could this mean for an independent Scotland if we did all these types of things? Because independence is not this wonderful position. We have to do all the right things. So a decade after independence, Scotland would have a private sector surplus, right? And the foreign sector would have a surplus. So we would be importing all of the stuff from the private sector. These two kind of twin deficits. The government would have a deficit, but our private sector would be net saving, right? And the situation that we can easily have under the UK in the next few years is that we are not net saving, that the private sector goes into deficit as we basically austerity. So the Scottish government would never have that position. We would always be net. We would always be net saving, and that would just be like a normal country. You know, we would be a normal country. And at the moment, we're moving down this way where we're becoming a very abnormal country with this restrictive fiscal framework and leading to austerity. So this idea that the twin deficits, they're not a problem. We don't consider that in any way. It's not an external constraint. So we would have a deficit, a trade deficit, but we would probably be reducing it for all the reasons that I said, concentrating on our trade and our food and our technology. And we'd have a job guarantee scheme, a well-being pension, anything that the government can purchase in its own currency, our government would be doing, much better buildings, roads. You know, this is why it's really important to have steel made in Scotland and all of our aggregates in Scotland, so we can purchase all that in the Scottish pound, and we can create the type of society that we want. But the public money's got to be used to create a resilient society. And I think all of these things gradually reduce these two deficits that Mark's worried about, especially the trade deficit.
Yeah, what we need is a political class that can see through this lens and see the possibilities that it can bring about for Scotland. So where can our audience learn more about this subject?
MMT, Scott. I mean, we cover this sometimes, don't we, Kieran? And it's a bit of a thread that goes through all of our episodes. But there's so much more. We're going to create a resource for MMT on the website in the next couple of months. But please do check out stuff by Bill Mitchell, The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton. A lot of the really succinct and great articles that Warren Mosler writes are really important. But, you know, we need to kind of start having these conversations. And if you feel strongly that the economy can be run differently, then look at this MMT lens, because it's really powerful, and the policies that come out from it, from this understanding, I think are really, really important. So I kind of wanted to, not that Mark Blythe would ever watch this episode, but I kind of wanted to go back to him and say, right, Mark, well, if you can explain to me why the current account is an external constraint, then I'd be willing to listen to you, because that's what he said to me. And I hope over this kind of last half an hour of the show, we've explained why we confidently believe that this isn't a constraint for Scotland.
And of course, you can learn more on our YouTube channel and via our podcast, which you can get in advance through our Patreon. So yeah, join us there, and we've got lots of material and lots of really interesting, fantastic guests for you to listen to on those podcasts or on the YouTube channel.
Yes, we have. And I'm just going to very quickly, because I know we've done an hour here, I'm just going to quickly look at these questions. Any politician, think tanks, or Scottish independence planning working with an MMT approach? Apart from us, Charles, no one has come out pretty confidently in any way like we have of the insights of MMT, and then I think there's a whole variety of reasons, and we're going to look into this in a little bit more detail, because it probably strikes you as being slightly incongruous that all the things that we've said, there's so many people in Scotland who believe this. Why haven't the think tanks, the politicians, people on the left adopted MMT? It's a really good question that we'd like to get to the bottom of. And hopefully we can find out answers for you, because it's a really good question to ask. Now, some people are very open to it, Commonweal, more than probably some of the other ones, but the political parties are just not willing to enter this at the moment. Charles, oh, that's great. Thanks very much. And I'll see if there's another question here from Chris. What said Chris? And could you post a suggested reading list for us non-economists, please? Yep, sure. I'll have a think about that. The deficit myth, is, if you haven't, is the best place to start on this. It's where most people have get an interest into and access into MMT. That's it. Well, thanks very much, everyone. I know there was another couple of questions about job guarantee and some other stuff. We've got episodes on a job guarantee. There's loads of things that you can do, but please do follow what we're doing. As Karen said, you can join our Patreon for like £3 a month to help us make more of these shows, more of the films that we're going to plan to do, and also pay for some academic research that's particular to Scotland around MMT. So thanks very much for everyone who's joined us this evening. Please do share if you think anyone would be interested in finding out how the economy really works and finding a little bit more about MMT. But I think that's it for us. Good luck, and choose wisely tomorrow, because it's a big day, of course. Karen, what are you doing tomorrow?
Of course, I'll be voting, and we've had our last committee before recess, so it's a little bit more relaxed for me for the next 6 weeks or so. Not that there won't be any work. There's still plenty of work to do, and there's always lots of reading I can do for my job all the time. I'm always trying to catch up with papers that have been sent to me. So I'll be trying to catch up with some of the academic papers.
You do work incredibly hard, so I'm sure you could do with a little bit of a break over the next few weeks, and we'll get you doing loads of stuff on SCOTONOMICS, of course, over that period. Next week, we've got a wonderful interview with Daniela Geber, who spoke for us, and she wrote an article in The Guardian today, which just basically said that Britain will be run by BlackRock. She goes into this in a lot of detail, and she puts some Scottish context as well. So please do watch that show tomorrow. It's a really important one if you want to understand what's going to happen with this Labour administration and why we need independence to change the way that our economies run. Good luck tomorrow, everyone who's working and doing everything around the election, and we'll see you next week. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye for now.
Good night.